Katie Miller sat on the edge of her bed, holding the faded photograph of her grandfather. In the picture, Frank Miller stood tall and proud in his white karate uniform with a black belt wrapped around his waist. His kind eyes seemed to look right at her, even after all these years. Katie ran her fingers over the glass frame and sighed. She missed him so much. 3 years had passed since Grandpa Frank died, but Katie still remembered how he would tell her stories about his karate adventures. After coming home from the war, he had traveled to Japan and trained with some of the best martial artists in the world. He opened his own small dojo when he returned to America and taught karate to hundreds of students over the years. "Katie, breakfast is ready," her mother Susan called from downstairs. Katie placed the photograph carefully on her nightstand and grabbed her backpack. Today was a big day. After begging her mom for months, Katie was finally going to start karate lessons at the Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy. In the kitchen, Susan was flipping pancakes while Katie's dad Joe read the newspaper at the table. Their small house on Maple Street was filled with the smell of coffee and syrup. "Are you excited about your first karate class today?" Joe asked, looking up from his paper. Katie nodded eagerly as she sat down. "Do you think I'll be any good at it?" Susan placed a stack of pancakes in front of her daughter. "Of course you will. You have your grandfather's spirit." "I wish Grandpa could teach me," Katie said, pouring syrup over her breakfast. "Mom, did you know Grandpa once broke 3 boards with one punch?" Susan smiled. "Yes, he was quite something. He would be so proud to see you following in his footsteps." After breakfast, Katie helped clear the table. She went to the living room and opened the wooden cabinet where her mother kept her grandfather's things. Inside was a polished box containing Frank's black belt, medals, and a few old photographs of him with famous martial artists. "Can I take one of Grandpa's pictures to show my instructor?" Katie asked. Susan thought for a moment. "Maybe not on the first day, honey. Let's just see how it goes first." Katie nodded, though she felt a little disappointed. She wanted everyone to know about her grandfather's amazing karate skills. Later that afternoon, Susan drove Katie to the Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy. The building was a large converted warehouse with a sign that read "Home of Champions" above the entrance. Through the glass doors, Katie could see trophies lining the walls. "Wow, this place looks serious," Katie said, suddenly feeling nervous. Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. "You'll be fine. Remember, everyone starts as a beginner." Inside, they were greeted by a woman at the front desk who handed Katie a white uniform. "You can change in the locker room," the woman said. "Class starts in 10 minutes. Parents can watch from the viewing area." Katie changed quickly into her new uniform. It felt stiff and a bit too big, but she loved how it made her feel, like a real martial artist. She folded her clothes neatly and placed them in a locker, just like her grandfather had taught her to be organized and respectful with her belongings. When Katie walked into the main training area, she saw about 20 other students already, warming up. Most were older kids and teenagers with a few adults mixed in. The training room was huge, with padded blue mats covering the floor and mirrors lining one wall. Framed certificates and more trophies decorated the other walls. A tall man with broad shoulders and a stern face stood at the front of the room. His black belt had several gold stripes on it, and he watched the students with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "That's Instructor Victor Hayes," a boy next to Katie whispered. "He's won the state championship 6 times. Katie nodded, impressed. She took a spot at the back of the class, trying to copy what the other students were doing as they stretched. "At you." Exactly 4 o'clock, Instructor Hayes clapped his hands loudly. "Line up," he commanded. The students hurried to form 3 neat rows. Katie found herself in the back row, trying to stand tall like the others. "Welcome to Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy," Hayes said in a loud, clear voice that filled the room. "For those of you who are new, I am Instructor Hayes. I have been teaching karate for 20 years and have trained champions at every level." He paced in front of the students, his hands clasped behind his back. "In this dojo, we follow 3 main rules: discipline, respect, and excellence. There is no room for weakness or excuses here." Katie listened carefully, her heart beating fast with excitement and a little fear. Instructor Hayes looked much stricter than her grandfather had been in his stories. Karate is not a game, Hayes continued. It is a serious martial art that requires total commitment. Some of you will not have what it takes to succeed here. His eyes scanned the room and briefly rested on Katie, making her stand up even straighter. We will begin with basic stances and punches, everyone feet shoulder-width apart. For the next hour, Katie tried her best to follow along as Hayes demonstrated various positions and movements. It was harder than she expected. Her legs began to ache from holding the stances, and her arms felt heavy as she practiced punches in the air. Miller, bend your knees more, Hayes called out, spotting Katie's mistake immediately. Katie quickly adjusted her stance, surprised that he already knew her name. The class continued with Hayes walking around, correcting students with sharp words and occasional demonstrations. During a water break, Katie noticed some photographs hanging near the water fountain. They showed Instructor Hayes with various famous martial artists. One picture caught her eye. It looked like a much younger Hayes standing next to someone who reminded her of her grandfather. "Excuse me," Katie said to a girl filling her water bottle. "Do you know if Instructor Hayes ever knew of Frank Miller?" The girl shrugged. "No idea. I wouldn't ask him personal questions, though. He doesn't like that." After the break, Hayes divided the class into groups based on experience. Since Katie was new, she joined 5 other beginners in a corner of the room with an assistant instructor, a woman named Laura. "Don't worry about getting everything perfect right away," Laura told them with a kind smile. "Karate takes time to learn." This made Katie feel better. Laura reminded her a little of how her grandfather talked about teaching in his stories, patient and encouraging. As they practiced basic blocks, Katie couldn't help thinking about her grandfather's techniques. He used to tell her that karate should flow like water, not be rigid like stone. "Laura," Katie asked during a pause, "my grandfather used to say that movements should be flowing, not stiff. Is that right?" Laura looked thoughtful. "There are different schools of thought in karate. Instructor Hayes teaches a very traditional, structured approach. But yes, some masters do emphasize more fluid movements." Katie nodded, feeling a connection to her grandfather. Maybe she could bring some of his ideas into her training. When class ended, the students lined up again and bowed to Instructor Hayes. Parents began coming in to pick up their children. Katie saw her mother waving from the viewing area. "How was it?" Susan asked as they walked to the car. "Hard," Katie admitted, "but I like it. Laura, the assistant teacher, is nice." "And Instructor Hayes?" Katie hesitated. "He's very serious, but I guess that's good for learning proper karate." That night, Katie was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open during dinner. Her muscles ached in places she didn't know could hurt. But as she got ready for bed, she felt proud of herself for making it through the first class. She picked up her grandfather's photograph from the nightstand and smiled at it. "I started karate today, Grandpa," she whispered. "It's really hard, but I'm going to keep trying. I want to be just like you someday." Katie placed the photo back and climbed into bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of standing proud in a black belt like her grandfather, with movements as flowing and powerful as water. She didn't know yet that her journey would soon bring her face to face with both the harshest and kindest sides of the martial arts world. 2 weeks passed, and Katie went to karate class every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Her white uniform was no longer stiff, and she had learned to tie her white belt properly without help. Each night after practice, Katie would soak her tired muscles in a warm bath and tell her parents what she had learned that day. On Saturday morning, Katie sat at the kitchen table eating cereal while her father fixed a leaky pipe under the sink. "Dad, did you ever watch Grandpa Frank teach karate?" Katie asked, swinging her legs back and forth. Joe slid out from under the sink and wiped his hands on a towel. "A few times. Your grandfather had a special way with his students. He was firm but kind." "Instructor Hayes isn't very kind," Katie said, stirring her cereal. "He yelled at Billy yesterday for talking during lineup." Joe sat down across from her. "Different teachers have different styles. The important thing is that you're learning." Katie nodded, but something didn't feel right. Her grandfather's stories about karate always included respect going both ways. from student to teacher and from teacher to student. That afternoon, Katie asked her mom if they could visit Grandma Rose, her grandfather's widow. Susan agreed, and soon they were pulling into the driveway of the small blue house where her grandparents had lived for 40 years. Grandma Rose welcomed them with warm hugs and the smell of freshly baked cookies. At 82, she moved slowly but still insisted on doing everything herself. Katie is taking karate classes now, Susan told Rose as they sat in the living room. Rose's eyes brightened. Just like Frank. Oh, he would be so proud. Grandma, do you have any of Grandpa's karate books? I want to learn more about his style, Katie asked. Rose nodded and led Katie to a bookshelf in the study. Frank kept all his martial arts books here. He studied many different styles over the years. Katie ran her fingers along the spines of dozens of books with titles like The Way of Karate and Mastering Martial Arts. Rose pulled out a worn leather journal. This was his teaching notebook. He wrote down all his training methods and philosophies, Rose said, handing it to Katie. I think he would want you to have it now. Katie held the journal carefully as if it were made of glass. Really? I can have it? Rose nodded. Of course, dear. Just promise to treat it with respect. I promise, Katie said, hugging her grandmother tightly. That night, Katie stayed up late reading her grandfather's journal by flashlight under her blankets. The pages were filled with detailed notes about techniques, but also thoughts about what karate truly meant. One passage caught her attention. True karate is not about domination, but harmony. The student must learn to move like water, adapting, flowing, yet powerful. A good teacher guides rather than forces, inspires rather than frightens. This is the way I learned from Master Lee, and this is the way I teach. Katie fell asleep with the journal on her chest, dreaming of water flowing, around rocks in a stream. The next day at school, Katie could hardly focus on her classes. She kept thinking about what she had read in her grandfather's journal. During lunch, she showed her best friend Lily some of the hand positions she had learned. That looks hard, Lily said, trying to copy Katie's knife hand block. It gets easier with practice, Katie replied. My grandfather wrote that you have to repeat a move 1,000 times before it becomes part of you. After school, Katie waited eagerly for her mother to drive her to karate class. She had tucked her grandfather's journal into her backpack, hoping to show some of his notes to Laura, the assistant instructor. When they arrived at the dojo, Katie noticed something different. There were camera crews setting up equipment near the entrance. What's going on? She asked the receptionist. Channel 8, News is doing a feature on Instructor Hayes and the dojo, the woman explained. They're filming today's class for a segment on local champions. Katie changed into her uniform quickly, excited about possibly being on TV. In the main training area, Instructor Hayes was dressed in his best uniform with all his medals pinned to his chest. He seemed even more serious than usual as he inspected the rows of students. Today we show the world what makes Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy the best dojo in the state, he announced. Everyone must perform perfectly. No mistakes will be tolerated. The class began with basic drills. Katie noticed that Hayes was demonstrating more advanced moves than they usually practiced. She struggled to keep up as he rapidly called out commands: punch, block, sidekick, faster. The cameras moved around the room, capturing different angles of the class. When Hayes demonstrated a complex kick, everyone clapped on cue, just as they had been instructed before class. During the water break, Katie took out her grandfather's journal and approached Laura, who was adjusting the younger students' stances. Laura, I found my grandfather's karate journal, Katie said excitedly. He wrote about how movements should flow like water. Look at these diagrams. Laura glanced nervously toward Hayes, who was being interviewed by a reporter. That's interesting, Katie, but maybe now isn't the best time. But these techniques might help me get better, Katie insisted. See how he explains the circular block? It's different from how we do it here. Hayes finished his interview and walked over, his face darkening when he saw the journal. What is this? He demanded, taking the journal from Katie's hands. It's my grandfather's karate journal, Katie explained. He was Frank Miller and he taught karate for 30 years. I thought, This is not how we teach at Pine Creek, Hayes interrupted, flipping through the pages with a frown. These methods are outdated and ineffective. Katie felt her cheeks grow hot. But my grandfather was really good. He learned from Master Lee in Japan and— Master Lee? Hayes scoffed. I've never heard of him. If he was any good, I would know his name. The entire class had gone silent watching the exchange. The camera crew had stopped filming the prepared demonstrations and were now pointing their equipment toward Katie and Hayes. My grandfather said that karate should flow like water, Katie said, her voice getting smaller, and that a good teacher inspires, rather than frightens. Hayes's face turned red. He closed the journal with a sharp snap. Your grandfather clearly didn't understand true karate. In this dojo, we follow my methods only. Katie reached for her journal, but Hayes held it away from her. Please give it back, she said. It's special to me. You can have it back after class, Hayes said coldly. And I don't want to hear any more about your grandfather's so-called legacy. It has no place here. Tears welled in Katie's eyes as Hayes placed the journal on a high shelf and ordered everyone back to their positions. She felt embarrassed and angry as she rejoined the class, trying not to cry in front of the cameras. For the rest of the session, Hayes ignored Katie completely, even when she struggled with a difficult stance. The other students avoided looking at her, afraid of drawing Hayes's attention. When class ended, Katie waited until everyone else had left before approaching the shelf where Hayes had put her journal. It was gone. Panicking, she looked around the room until she spotted Hayes in his office, the journal open on his desk. Taking a deep breath, Katie knocked on the office door. Hayes looked up with an annoyed expression. What do you want, Miller? May I have my grandfather's journal back, please? Katie asked politely, remembering her mother's advice to always be respectful to teachers. Hayes leaned back in his chair. I'm reviewing it to see what nonsense you've been filling your head with. Some of these ideas could damage your progress here. But it's mine, Katie said, her voice shaking slightly. My grandma gave it to me. Hayes stood up, towering over her. Listen carefully. In this dojo, there is only one way to learn karate, my way. I am trying to make you a champion, but you can't become one if you're confused by outdated methods. Katie fought back tears. My grandfather was a great teacher. Many of his students won competitions too. Hayes's patience snapped. He slammed his hand down on the desk, making Katie jump. Enough about your grandfather. If he was so great, why have I never heard of him? Why isn't his name known in professional circles? He was probably just a hobbyist who taught in his garage. The insult to her grandfather's memory was too much. Tears spilled down Katie's cheeks as she reached for the journal. That's not true. He was respected, and Hayes grabbed the journal first and held it up out of her reach. This stays with me until you learn some respect. Now get out of my office. Katie backed away, trembling. As she turned to leave, she bumped into someone, standing in the doorway. Her mother, who had come early to pick her up and heard everything. Susan's face was tight with anger. What's going on here? She demanded, putting a protective arm around Katie's shoulders. The confrontation was about to reach a whole new level. Susan Miller stood in the doorway of Instructor Hayes's office, her eyes moving from her tearful daughter to the karate instructor, holding Frank's journal out of reach. The small office felt even smaller with the tension filling the air. I asked, What's going on here? Susan repeated, her voice calm but firm. Hayes lowered the journal slightly and straightened his posture. Mrs. Miller, I was just explaining to Katie that outside material can interfere with her training. That journal belonged to my father, Susan said, stepping fully into the office. It was a gift to Katie from her grandmother. Hayes placed the journal on his desk, keeping his hand on top of it. I understand your attachment to it, but as Katie's instructor, I need to ensure she learns proper technique. Some of these old methods could create bad habits. Katie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform. He said Grandpa was just a hobbyist who taught in his garage. Susan's face hardened. My father was Frank Miller. He trained in Japan for 10 years and ran the Riverside Dojo for 3 decades. His students included police officers, military personnel, And yes, even competition champions. Hayes looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. I've been in the karate world for 20 years, Mrs. Miller, and I've never heard this name. Perhaps he was known locally, but... My father didn't seek fame, Susan interrupted. He taught karate because he believed in its principles of respect, discipline, and harmony. She held out her hand. Now, please return my father's journal to my daughter. The office fell silent. 2 other students waiting for their parents had stopped to watch the confrontation through the open door. Laura, the assistant instructor, stood nearby looking worried. Hayes seemed to realize he had an audience. He picked up the journal and handed it to Susan rather than Katie. I meant no disrespect. I'm simply concerned about Katie's progress. Susan took the journal and gave it to Katie, who clutched it to her chest. Thank you for your concern, but I believe my daughter can learn from both her grandfather's wisdom and your instruction. Hayes nodded stiffly. Of course. However, in this dojo, we follow a specific curriculum that has proven successful. I cannot allow exceptions. Katie looked between her mother and Hayes, feeling the tension. She didn't want to quit karate, but she also couldn't stand hearing anyone insult her grandfather's memory. Perhaps we should discuss this another time, Susan suggested, guiding Katie toward the door. When emotions aren't so high. They had almost reached the exit when Hayes called after them. Mrs. Miller, if Katie wants to continue training here, she needs to commit fully to our methods. No more talk about alternative techniques in class. Susan paused but didn't turn around. We'll think about it, she said, leading Katie out to the parking lot. In the car, Katie burst into tears again. I'm sorry, Mom. I just wanted to show Laura some of Grandpa's ideas. Susan started the engine but didn't drive away immediately. You have nothing to be sorry for, Katie. I'm proud of you for standing up for Grandpa's memory. What do we do now? Do I have to quit karate? Susan thought for a moment. That's up to you. We could look for another dojo, or you could stay and just focus on learning what Hayes teaches during class hours. Katie looked down at the journal in her lap. I want to keep learning karate. Grandpa would want me to continue. Then that's what we'll do, Susan said with a smile. We'll figure it out. That evening, Katie's father was furious when he heard what had happened. Who does this guy think he is? Joe demanded, pacing the living room. Frank was twice the martial artist he'll ever be. Joe, please, Susan said, nodding toward Katie, who was listening from the couch. We need to handle this calmly. Joe sat down next to Katie and put his arm around her. Your grandfather was respected by everyone who knew him. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Katie nodded, feeling better with her parents' support. She opened the journal and showed them a page with a photo of her grandfather standing next to a famous martial artist. Grandpa knew lots of important people, see? This is him with Chuck Norris. Joe examined the faded photograph. That's right. They met at a martial arts expo in the 80s. Chuck Norris was already famous from his movies by then. Who's Chuck Norris? Katie asked. Only one of the greatest martial artists of all time, Joe explained. He was a world champion before becoming a movie star. Your grandfather always spoke highly of him. An idea formed in Katie's mind, but she kept it to herself. That night, she wrote a letter addressing it carefully before placing it in an envelope. She would need her mother's help to find the right address, but it was worth a try. The next day was Saturday, and Katie spent the morning practicing karate moves in the backyard, using her grandfather's journal as a guide. The flowing movements felt natural to her, like dancing rather than fighting. Susan watched from the kitchen window, smiling at her daughter's determination. When Katie came inside for lunch, Susan had news. I spoke with Instructor Hayes this morning, she said, placing a sandwich in front of Katie. We came to an understanding. You can continue your classes, and he promised to be more respectful of your grandfather's legacy. Katie took a bite of her sandwich and chewed thoughtfully. Did he really promise that? He did, Susan assured her. I also reminded him that the TV crew caught his behavior on camera yesterday. He seemed quite concerned about that. Katie smiled for the first time since the incident. So I can go back on Monday? If you want to, Susan said. but I also found another dojo across town that follows a more traditional Japanese style. We could visit it next weekend if you're interested." Katie considered this option. "I want to give Instructor Hayes another chance. Grandpa always said we should try to resolve conflicts before walking away." Monday afternoon came quickly. Katie felt nervous as she changed into her uniform. What if Hayes was still angry with her? What if the other students made fun of her for crying? Laura greeted her warmly as she entered the training area. "Good to see you back, Katie. Don't worry about Friday, it's forgotten." Katie wasn't so sure about that, but she thanked Laura and joined the other students who were stretching. A few gave her friendly nods, while others looked away awkwardly. Instructor Hayes entered the room at exactly 4 o'clock, wearing his usual stern expression. He led the class through warm-up exercises without looking directly at Katie. During a partner drill, Katie was paired with Billy, a boy who had started the same day she did. "Is it true your grandpa was a famous karate master?" Billy whispered, as they practiced blocking each other's punches. "He wasn't famous," Katie replied, "but he was really good and respected by other masters." "That's cool," Billy said. "My dad only watches football." Their conversation was cut short as Hayes approached. "Less talking, more practice," he ordered, watching them with critical eyes. The class progressed normally until they began learning a new kata, a series of movements performed in a specific sequence. Hayes demonstrated the kata once, his movements precise and powerful. "This is the Hien Niden kata," he explained. "It teaches proper body positioning and timing. Watch carefully." As the students attempted to copy the movements, Katie recognized some similarities to techniques in her grandfather's journal. She followed along, trying to incorporate the flowing style her grandfather had described while still matching Hayes's instructions. Hayes walked around the room, correcting students' postures and movements. When he reached Katie, he stopped and watched her for a long moment. "Your stance is too wide," he said finally, "and your turns are too rounded. In this kata, movements must be sharp and direct." Katie adjusted her stance. "Yes, sir." Hayes demonstrated the correct movement. "Like this. Strong and forceful, not flowing like water." The deliberate reference to her grandfather's philosophy made Katie's cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral and copied Hayes's movement exactly. "Better," Hayes said curtly before moving on to the next student. The rest of the class passed, without incident, but Katie could feel Hayes watching her more closely than before. She tried her best to follow his instructions precisely, even when they contradicted what she had read in her grandfather's journal. After class, as students were, leaving the front door of the dojo opened, a man walked in, causing several parents to turn and stare. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, but moved with the easy confidence of someone much younger. He wore jeans and a simple button-up shirt, and his beard was neatly trimmed. The man looked around the dojo until his eyes settled on Katie, who was putting on her shoes. He smiled and walked toward her. "You must be Katie Miller," he said in a gentle voice that somehow carried authority. "I got your letter about your grandfather, Frank." Katie stared up at the man, her mouth falling open in shock as she recognized him from the photograph in her grandfather's journal. It was Chuck Norris. The dojo fell silent as people recognized Chuck Norris. Parents pulled out their phones to take pictures while students whispered excitedly to each other. Katie stood frozen, unable to believe that her letter had actually reached him, much less that he had come in person. "Mr. Norris," she finally managed to say, "you really came." Chuck smiled warmly. "When I get a letter about Frank Miller's granddaughter, I make time." He looked around the dojo. Frank was a good friend and an excellent martial artist. Instructor Hayes had been in his office when Chuck arrived. Now he emerged, his face showing surprise and confusion. He quickly composed himself and approached with an extended hand. "Chuck Norris, this is an incredible honor. Welcome to Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy. I'm Instructor Victor Hayes." Chuck shook his hand politely but kept his attention on Katie. "Frank's granddaughter wrote to me about her grandfather's journal and some disagreements about teaching methods." Hayes's smile faltered slightly. "Ah, yes. A minor misunderstanding that's been resolved. Katie is a promising student." "Is that so?" Chuck turned back to Katie. Would you mind showing me this journal you mentioned in your letter? Katie nodded eagerly and ran to her backpack. She returned with the worn leather journal and handed it to Chuck with both hands, showing respect as her grandfather had taught her. Chuck carefully opened the journal, his eyes softening as he flipped through the pages. I recognize Frank's handwriting. We exchanged letters about karate philosophy for years. He paused at a page with a diagram of flowing movements. I remember this. Frank was developing his water technique after studying with Master Tanaka in Okinawa. Hayes cleared his throat. While these older methods have historical value, modern competitive karate has evolved. Our approach has produced state champions for 6 consecutive years. Chuck looked up with a thoughtful expression. Competition is only one aspect of martial arts. Frank understood that karate is also about personal growth and harmony. By now, most of the students who had been leaving had stopped to watch. Parents who had been waiting in cars came inside when they heard Chuck Norris was there. Even Laura, who had been cleaning equipment in the back room, stood nearby with wide eyes. Perhaps, Chuck suggested, I could see some of your students. Demonstrate both approaches. It would be interesting to compare. Hayes couldn't refuse such a request from someone as famous as Chuck Norris, especially with so many witnesses. Of course, we were just finishing for the day, but I'd be happy to have some students stay for a special demonstration. He turned to the remaining students. Who would like to demonstrate our kata for Mr. Norris? Several hands shot up, including Katie's. Hayes selected 3 advanced students with brown belts but ignored Katie's raised hand. Excellent, he said. Ryan, Amber, and Jason will demonstrate the Heian Godan kata we've been perfecting for the regional tournament. The 3 students moved to the center of the training area and performed the kata with precise, powerful movements. Their faces showed intense concentration as they punched, blocked, and kicked in perfect unison. When they finished, everyone applauded. Very impressive, Chuck said. Strong stances and powerful techniques. Hayes smiled proudly. This is what we strive for, excellence through discipline and precision. Chuck nodded and then turned to Katie. And now I'd like to see Katie demonstrate some of the movements from her grandfather's journal. Hayes's smile disappeared. Katie is a beginner who just started a few weeks ago. She hasn't mastered even basic techniques yet. I don't expect mastery, Chuck said kindly. I'd just like to see what she's learned from Frank's teachings. Before Hayes could object further, Katie stepped forward. I can show the flowing block sequence from page 23. I've been practicing it at home. She moved to the center of the mat, took a deep breath, and began the sequence. Unlike the sharp, rigid movements of the advanced students, Katie's blocks flowed from one to the next like water moving around obstacles. Her movements weren't as powerful or precise as the older students, but they had a natural grace that made them seem effortless. When she finished, Chuck applauded first, followed by the other parents and students. Frank would be proud, he said. You've captured the essence of his water technique. Hayes stepped forward, his face tight with barely controlled anger. While that was interesting, it lacks the power and focus needed for effective self-defense or competition. May I? Chuck asked, moving to stand beside Katie. I'd like to demonstrate something. Hayes nodded stiffly. Of course. Chuck stood in a relaxed stance. Victor, would you throw a punch at me? Not too fast, just a standard straight punch. Hayes looked surprised but moved into position. He threw a controlled punch toward Chuck's chest. Despite his age, Chuck's response was lightning quick. His block flowed around Hayes's arm, redirecting the force while barely seeming to move. And one smooth motion, he gently guided Hayes forward, causing him to stumble slightly. That, Chuck explained to the watching students, is the principle of Frank's water technique. Using your opponent's energy against them rather than meeting force with force. He turned to address everyone. Both approaches have value. The strong, direct method that Instructor Hayes teaches builds power and discipline. The flowing method that Frank Miller developed builds adaptability and efficiency. The best martial artists understand and can use both. Hayes straightened his uniform, clearly embarrassed at being off-balanced so easily. Perhaps for advanced students, but beginners need structure and clear rules. Chuck smiled. Frank always said that students should learn to flow before they learn to fight, like learning to swim before diving into deep water. Katie watched in amazement as her grandfather's philosophy was defended by one of the most famous martial artists in the world. She felt a surge of pride and validation. Chuck turned to Hayes. I understand you have a tournament coming up. Mind if I work with some of your students? I could show them how to incorporate both approaches. On the spot, Hayes could hardly refuse. It would be an honor, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. For the next half hour, Chuck worked with several students, including Katie. He showed them how to maintain power while adding fluidity to their movements, and how to transition smoothly between techniques. The students absorbed every word, thrilled to be learning from a legend. Parents watched from the sidelines, many recording videos on their phones. Laura took careful notes, occasionally asking Chuck to repeat a movement so she could understand it better. Hayes stood to the side, his arms crossed and his expression darkening as he watched his students eagerly embrace methods he had dismissed just days earlier. When Chuck demonstrated a flowing kata that combined traditional movements with Frank's water technique, the entire room erupted in applause. Finally, Chuck gathered everyone together. Thank you all for letting me share these ideas with you. Martial arts is a lifelong journey of learning and growth. The best teachers remain students themselves, always open to new approaches. He placed a hand on Katie's shoulder. Frank Miller's legacy lives on through his family and his ideas. I'm honored to help share some of what he taught me over the years. Hayes stepped forward, aware that his reputation was at stake. Thank you for visiting our dojo, Mr. Norris. Your insights have been educational. Chuck nodded politely, then turned to Katie. I'd like to speak with you and your mother privately, if that's okay. Susan, who had arrived during the demonstration, came forward. Of course, Mr. Norris. As they moved toward the office, Hayes called out, Katie, don't forget we have class on Wednesday. I expect you to be on time. Katie looked at her mother, who gave a small nod. Yes, sir, Katie replied. But as she walked away with Chuck Norris and her mother, Katie wondered if she would ever return to Hayes's dojo again. Something told her that her karate journey was about to take an unexpected turn. In the small office at the back of the dojo, Katie sat between her mother and Chuck Norris. She still couldn't believe that a martial arts legend was sitting there talking about her grandfather, as if they had been old friends. Frank and I met at a tournament in 1983, Chuck explained, showing them a page in the journal with his signature. He wasn't interested in trophies or fame. He just loved the art and philosophy of karate. Susan smiled, remembering her father. Dad always said, the medals were just metal, but the lessons were gold. Chuck nodded. That sounds like Frank. He taught me some techniques that I still use today, especially his water method for redirecting energy. Katie traced her finger over her grandfather's handwriting. Instructor Hayes doesn't think Grandpa's methods are good enough for real karate. Chuck looked thoughtful. There are many paths in martial arts. Hayes focuses on one path, competition and power. Your grandfather understood something deeper about balance and harmony. What should I do? Katie asked. I want to keep learning karate, but Hayes doesn't respect Grandpa's legacy. Before Chuck could answer, there was a knock at the office door. Hayes entered without waiting for a response. Excuse me, he said, his voice strained but polite. The parents are asking if Mr. Norris would sign some autographs before he leaves. Chuck smiled. Of course, I'll be right there. Hayes nodded stiffly and left. Chuck turned back to Katie and Susan. I have a suggestion, if you're interested, he said. I know a dojo about 30 minutes from here run by Linda Chen. She studied with some of the same masters as your grandfather and teaches a balanced approach to karate. Really? Katie's eyes widened with excitement. Really? Chuck confirmed. I can call her tonight if you'd like. She would be honored to have Frank Miller's granddaughter as a student. Susan looked relieved. That sounds perfect. I was worried we might have to drive much farther to find a good alternative. One more thing, Chuck added, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a worn black belt with gold embroidery. Frank gave this to me years ago when I admired the craftsmanship. I think he would want you to have it now, Katie. Katie accepted the belt with trembling hands. This was Grandpa's? His first black belt from Japan, Chuck confirmed. He got newer ones later, but this one meant the most to him. Tears filled Katie's eyes as she ran her fingers over the faded gold stitching of her grandfather's name in Japanese characters. Thankwer. You, she whispered. Chuck stood up. Let's go sign those autographs, and then I have an idea for how to handle Instructor Hayes. When they returned to the main training area, parents and students had formed a line for autographs. Chuck patiently signed papers, belts, and even a few phone cases, chatting warmly with each person. Katie noticed that many people were also looking at her with new interest, whispering about her connection to Chuck Norris and her grandfather. Finally, when the last autograph was signed, Chuck addressed Hayes directly. Victor, may I speak with you privately for a moment? Hayes nodded and led Chuck to a quiet corner of the dojo. Their conversation was too low for others to hear, but Katie could see Hayes's face change from defensive to concerned as Chuck spoke. Occasionally, Chuck would gesture toward Katie or the students, his expression serious but not angry. After about 10 minutes, the two men returned. Hayes looked humbled, and Chuck appeared satisfied with whatever had been said. Students and parents, Hayes announced, his voice less commanding than usual. I have an important announcement. Starting next month, Pine Creek Martial Arts Academy will be offering a new traditional class that incorporates various karate philosophies, including the water technique developed by Master Frank Miller. Surprised murmurs spread through the room. Hayes continued. Assistant Instructor Laura will be leading this class after receiving special training. Mr. Norris has generously offered to visit occasionally to share his knowledge as well. Laura stepped forward, unable to hide her excitement. I've always been interested in traditional karate forms beyond competition styles. This is an amazing opportunity. Hayes turned to Katie. Katie Miller will be helping Laura understand her grandfather's methods as documented in his journal. He paused, visibly struggling with his next words. I owe Katie and her family an apology for not showing proper respect to Master Miller's legacy. In the true spirit of karate, I acknowledge this mistake and seek to correct it. The room fell, silent. No one had ever heard Hayes apologize before. Katie was stunned, but a warm feeling of pride spread through her chest. Her grandfather's methods would be taught at the dojo after all. Chuck placed a hand on Hayes' shoulder. A true master knows when to bend like water rather than stand rigid like stone. This decision shows wisdom, Victor. Hayes nodded, though he still didn't look entirely comfortable with the situation. Thank you for your guidance, Mr. Norris. As people began to leave, talking excitedly about the new class and Chuck Norris's visit, Katie approached Hayes. Thank you for apologizing, she said. My grandfather always said that admitting mistakes takes more courage than winning fights. Hayes looked at her with new respect. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. I should have listened to you from the beginning. Katie smiled. I'm going to train at Master Chen's dojo, but I'd like to visit sometimes and help Laura with Grandpa's journal. You would be welcome, Hayes said sincerely. The next Saturday morning, Susan drove Katie to Linda Chen's dojo, Harmony Martial Arts Center. The building was smaller than Hayes' dojo, with traditional Japanese decorations and a garden visible through the windows. Master Chen greeted them at the door, a petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of quiet confidence. Welcome, Katie Miller. Chuck has told me all about you and your grandfather. She led them inside where a class was already in progress. Katie watched in amazement as students moved through forms that combined strong, direct movements with flowing transitions, exactly the blend of styles that her grandfather had described in his journal. Your grandfather and I trained under the same master in Okinawa, Linda explained. His water technique influenced many of us, though few gave him proper credit for his innovations. She showed Katie a wall of photographs that included several pictures of her grandfather with various martial arts masters, including a younger Linda Chen. We honor those who came before us here. Your grandfather's legacy has always been respected in traditional circles, even if the competition-focused schools forgot him. Katie felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't experienced at Hayes's dojo. Here, her grandfather wasn't an outsider with outdated methods. He was a respected master whose ideas lived on. As she changed into her uniform for her first class, Katie carefully tied her white belt. Master Chen had explained that despite her family connection, she would start as a beginner and earn each new belt through hard work and dedication. Katie was perfectly happy with this. Her grandfather would have wanted it that way. She placed her grandfather's black belt in her training bag, where she could see it during class as inspiration. Someday she would earn the right to wear it, but for now, it was enough to know that her grandfather's legacy was secure. When Katie joined the other students on the training floor, Master Chen introduced her to the class. Today we welcome Katie Miller, granddaughter of Master Frank Miller, whose water technique many of you have been learning. The students bowed respectfully to Katie, who bowed back with a full heart. Let us begin with the flowing forms, Master, Chen announced. Remember what Master Miller always taught. Be strong like the mountain but flow like the water. As Katie moved through her first lesson, she felt as if her grandfather was there with her, guiding her movements. She knew her journey in karate was just beginning, but thanks to her courage in standing up for her grandfather's legacy and an unexpected visit from Chuck Norris, she was on the right path. That evening, she added her own first entry to her grandfather's journal. Today I learned that a true legacy lives on not in trophies or fame, but in the hearts and minds of those who carry the teachings forward. Thank you, Grandpa, for showing me the way of water. I will make you proud.